And so Lee is running equipment and supplies and people around this string of laboratories that's set up in uptown New Orleans.
Now, did he, it's my guess that Lee pretended to meet her on accident, but he was probably sent to meet her because the story is that she dropped a book outside of the post office, and he was kind enough to bend down and pick it up, and they engaged a conversation. They went on for a nice leisurely walk, you know, in New Orleans.
And he charmed her with his intelligent conversation and all that.
Just by coincidence.
Well, I don't think there's any chance that it was accidental.
Sure.
I mean, because if it's accidental, you have to explain how he winds up introducing her to David Ferrie in 24 hours.
Yeah.
And then in another 24 hours, there's a party at David Ferrie's apartment at which Mary Sherman attends. And then he coordinates the whole thing with Ochsner, and it's Ochsner that's brought her in there in the first place.
Yeah.
I mean, if that's an accident, you know, I got some swampland I want to talk to you about.
Jim, why are these books, Dr. Mary's Monkey and Me and Lee, so important?
Oh, well, that's an easy one, Alex. Number one, once you understand about the adulteration of the polio vaccine back in the 50s, then you'll begin to understand why there's been such an upsurge in the cancer rate. So this is a story that affects millions of people. I mean, this actually impacts the public, all right? Not some celebrity news that who cares except the people involved. And the second thing is it also rips open the incredible tangled and darkly woven tapestry behind the Kennedy assassination and shows you the interconnections between CIA and FBI intelligence agencies, the military, secret laboratories, secret biochemical warfare testing, the war against Castro, and what role Lee Harvey Oswald played in all this. He was not just some lone schnook off the street. And if you'll read Ed's two books, Dr. Mary's Monkey and Me and Lee, you will find out not only what Lee Harvey Oswald was actually up to when he was in New Orleans in the summer of 1963, but how he connects into this matrix of powerful and violent groups that were behind the Kennedy assassination.
The first thing to realize is where New Orleans is. I mean, New Orleans is at the mouth of the Mississippi River, and trade is the major business. So trade with Latin America is the major component of that. And so in the 50s, there was a lot of trade with Cuba. Okay, so the moment the embargo happens, New Orleans loses 25% of its business. And then Castro and Che are talking about taking the revolution to South America. Well, if they do that, there go the coffee beans and there go the bananas, okay? So there's a lot of economic pressure, and Ochsner's in the middle of this. I mean, if you look at Ochsner's hospital, he's got all these flagpoles out front, and there's Guatemala, Honduras, you know. He's got the whole thing down to Argentina, okay? Because the business model, the premise of his entire hospital is he's going to supply medical services to the oligarchy of Latin America. Okay, well, if you overthrow the oligarchy, there goes his business. Okay, so all these people in New Orleans, from the coffee barons to the banana people to the medical people, all have a common economic interest, which Castro is threatening. Okay, that's sort of the first point. The second point is in 1962, October of 1962, we have the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, actually, those missiles were in there earlier, but it wasn't a public issue until 62, all right? And in 62, we're sitting there in New Orleans looking at this big circle, and there's New Orleans, and here are the missiles, and it's 40 minutes away from us, okay? And so, you know, we're wondering, you know, if we're going to die before dinner, you know, I mean, basically, there. And New Orleans took this threat of Soviet missiles very personally. And because we were the ones that were visualizing our city in flames, okay? And so it was at that point in time that they took a project that they had previously been doing and turned it into a bioweapon project, okay? Now, this other project starts with the contamination of the polio vaccine in the 1950s. And what happens is, after they release 100 million doses of the polio vaccine, which has been grown on monkey kidney cells, they realized that one of the dozens of monkey viruses that they knew were in the vaccine actually causes cancer. So this is like the biggest mistake in history. I mean, they have mass inoculated the American population, particularly the children, with a cancer-causing virus. And therefore, the logical conclusion of that is we have an epidemic of cancer on the horizon.
This is absolute fact. And the magnitude of it in suffering, if you've ever watched a family member, wheezing and battling for breath in their deathbed, dying of cancer, and you know that depending on the cancers, they're up thousands of percentile. And the government tries to cook the numbers, keep it quiet, kind of like unemployment numbers. It's exponential. The United States leads the world in illness, in cancer.
And what we see is a massive eruption of soft tissue cancers happens right after the polio vaccine. But in the real-time experience of it from the players involved, they realized this in 1958. And they stamp it secret because they don't want to be held accountable for it. And then they get really busy trying to make a vaccine. And in the polio vaccine, they had 3 flavors of polio to work with. I'll call them heavy, medium, and light. Okay. Right. In this SV40, which is the cancer-causing monkey viruses, they have 1 flavor, and it's heavy. Okay, and what they want to do is try to get this thing to mutate into a benign form that they can, or a less strong form that they can use as a vaccine, hopefully to prevent the epidemic of cancer. And this is like nobody wants to admit they're doing this research because they don't want to explain why they're doing the research. Okay, so this is set up as a medical Manhattan project.
The world will never know the true facts of what occurred, my motives. The people that had so much to gain and have such a material motive for putting me in a position I'm in will never let the true facts come above board to the world.
Now these people are in very high positions yet?
Yes.
Okay, it's also been claimed that Jack Ruby died of cancer. You want to get into that a little bit?
Well, that claim was made very early in 1967, shortly after Ruby died. And what we now know is several things that are really important about that. First of all, the biological weapon that Judy and Lee were working on took 28 days to work. Okay. And
which is about the time it took him to develop cancer and die.
That's right. It was 28 days from the day Jack Ruby was diagnosed with cancer to the day he died. Okay, so that's point one. We got a time match there. Secondly, Jack Ruby passed a note to his guard that said, they have injected me with cancer. Okay, so we had Jack Ruby saying it, all right? Thirdly, turns out that Jack Ruby is part of the money financing for this bioweapons lab, and he's bag-manning money from Dallas down to New Orleans for this project, and they explain the whole project to him, all right? So he's there in David Ferrie's apartment with Judy Ann Lee, so he knows that they have a biological weapon capable of killing people in this manner. Then there's a very fine Chinese-American doctor who was taking care of Jack Ruby, and then one day they told him his services were no longer available. The last time he saw Jack Ruby, he was fine, okay? And then about 6 weeks later, Jack Ruby's dead, okay? Marduk is his name, M-A-R-D-U-C-K. They then bring in somebody from, quote, out of town who actually has no real credentials except as a psychiatrist, but he's got a lot of contacts with the CIA. And it is him, his name is Jolie West, or sometimes called Jolly West, who is suspected of being the person who actually injects Jack Ruby with the cancer weapon. And what's really interesting to me, I was discussing this with Jim Marrs on the phone one night, and Jim said that when he was teaching his course on JFK, he had somebody come and take the course who actually operated a electron microscope. and had examined the cancer cells from Jack Ruby. And there's sort of this type of cell and that type of cell, and they are never together. And he found, because they come from different organs in the body, and he found both of these cells in Jack Ruby's tumor, suggesting that it's all was mixed up in a cancer cocktail, just like they were doing. Sure. And part of that is the lung cancer cells were found in his liver or whatever it was, you know. And so there is, from a real scientific forensic point of view, there is evidence that says Ruby was probably killed with cancer. And of course, the timing of it was perfect because he couldn't talk. Sure. So that says one of the uses of the biological weapon is to dispose of witnesses while they're awaiting trial in jail.
Well, I noticed in the book, Me and Lee, that you referenced Oswald's time cards. Now, can you tell us about the significance of all that? Okay.
Well, one of the things that is very conspicuous about the Warren Commission volumes is they included all kind of information that didn't have anything to do with the real issue, like the dental records of Jack Ruby's mother is the great example on that.
That was fascinating reading, by the way. Just kidding.
But one of the things they did not include was the time cards, Lee Harvey Oswald's time cards from the Riley Coffee Company. Now, this is a pretty conspicuous omission, and when the JFK Records Act came through and we got into the deeper files, we found that the FBI had collected those from the Riley Coffee Company and had turned them over to the Warren Commission. So someone in the Warren Commission said, we don't want these things in the Warren Commission volumes, even though we have them as evidence. And what's interesting about that is when you read the Warren Commission, they interview Oswald's supervisor. And he says, oh, he was this horrible employee. I could never find him. He was off campus when he's clocked in and all this stuff. I mean, you read that and you say, okay, you're his supervisor. Why were you approving his time cards? Sure. If you thought he was cheating the company, okay? Well, the point is, the supervisor was not approving his time cards. The person that was responsible for approving Lee Oswald's time cards was William Moynihan, who was Judy's boss. And when he wasn't around, Judy signed for him.
So she actually signed Lee Harvey Oswald's time cards on occasion.
Right, and her initials are on there, and we compare these initials on the time cards with other documents like her college ID and things that she wrote at the time, and you can see it's her initials.
So that's why, so if that were to be allowed in the Warren Commission...
The logical question any investigator would have asked is whose initials is that?
Yeah.
Okay, and that's what they didn't want to do. They didn't want to get into who is Judy Very Baker and why was she in New Orleans, because that leads you to the underground medical laboratory and the biological weapon.
Wow. You know, when Ed Haslam began to investigate the cold case file on Dr. Mary Sherman, he never imagined that it would connect some of the most prominent people in New Orleans to Lee Harvey Oswald or the mafia or the dark forces deep within the United States government. But that's exactly where this investigation leads, and then some. After all, this book is not just about the murder of John F. Kennedy. The story ultimately leads to something that affects all of us, and that is the cancer epidemic. And just like historian and investigative journalist Jim Marrs noted in the video you just watched, this book will change your whole perspective on what really went down in Dallas and the murder of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. I guess you can say that Dr. Mary's monkey is the missing link in the JFK assassination. That's going to do it for tonight's program. We hope you enjoyed the show. The InfoWars Nightly News will return next Monday through Friday, 7 o'clock p.m. Central Time. Until then, hope you all have a blessed weekend. We'll see you back right here on Monday. Good night.